Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into a world where being gentle, kind, and alone can be the most dangerous thing you could possibly be. Picture this. The air is damp with the scent of moss, a pale crescent moon hangs low over the dark forest, and the thin smoke from your own chimney curls upward like it's trying to escape the village entirely. You stand at the doorway of your little timber cottage. Nothing fancy, just a crooked roof and walls that groan a little in the wind. The forest behind you is full of rustles and shifting shadows, the kind that make your imagination invent faces. You probably won't survive this, no offense, but you're a widow in medieval Europe, and that's about as safe as walking into a beehive wearing honey perfume. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The village never quite trusts a home set too close to the tree line. To them, the forest is where wolves hide, where bandits vanish, where the devil himself might drop by for tea. Your place, small, sturdy, but with one shutter that always hangs slightly askew, sits right at the border. That alone is enough to make people tilt their heads when you pass. The road that runs past your cottage is more of a dirt vein than a street, marked by cart ruts and stones that jut like broken teeth. In summer, it's coated in dust that clings to your hem. In winter, it's an icy ribbon you pray you don't slip on while carrying firewood. In the morning, the mist tends to pool low around your house before spilling lazily toward the village. It's beautiful in that haunting way, like a painting. But beauty can be suspicious here. People mutter about thin places, spots where the world of the living brushes up against something else. Your home, inconveniently, is one of them. You keep to yourself mostly. The chickens you tend are quiet. The goat is cranky but loyal, and your garden stubbornly produces more onions than anyone could eat. That doesn't matter. In a place where every unusual thing has a meaning, even your onions could be taken as a sign. Too many in a year, and someone will joke about you feeding them moonlight. Historically, widows in the Middle Ages walked a knife's edge. Without a husband to speak for you in the eyes of the law, your words carried less weight. Property disputes could turn ugly quickly, and gossip had the strength of a court document. It's recorded that in some regions, up to 80% of those accused of witchcraft were women, many of them older, poorer, or, most damningly, alone. The quirky part? Not all accusations started from malice. Sometimes a neighbor truly believed they were helping save your soul by pointing out your oddities. Historians still argue whether certain bursts of witch trials were more about actual fear of the supernatural or just an extremely convenient way to settle scores and grab property. Personally, I think it's like when someone insists pineapple on pizza is evil. It's not about the pineapple, it's about the fight. You've lived here long enough to know which doors slam shut when you pass. You hear the difference between a polite good day and the kind that comes with a smirk. But still, you keep sweeping your front step each morning, stacking wood just so, and feeding that grumpy goat. The forest keeps you company. In the low hours when the moon dips and the frost starts to lace the edges of the roof, you can almost believe the trees are leaning in to listen. There's comfort in that. Or maybe that's just the sort of thing someone would later call talking to spirits. Tonight, you bank the fire early. The wind pushes at the shutters, the goat mutters in its pen, and somewhere an owl gives a long, low call, the kind that might be hunting or warning. You let the sound settle into your bones, trying not to think about how quickly peace can turn into suspicion here. Morning comes, in that gray, reluctant way it does in late autumn. Light seeping into the sky like someone spilled a pot of thin milk. The first sound you hear isn't the rooster from the village, but the steady, rhythmic tapping from outside. At first, you think it's rain, but no, the air is too still. You open the crooked shutter just a little, and there it is, a large black crow, perched right on your fence post, looking at you as if it knows your middle name. Its feathers catch the light with that oil-slick sheen, each one edged with tiny glints of blue and green. The beak opens, and out comes a sound not like the usual caw, but something slower, almost conversational. You tell yourself it's just a bird. Nature happens. But in a place like this, even a bird can become a messenger in someone else's story. By the time you step outside, your breath fogging in the cold air, the crow is gone. Only the imprint of its claws remains on the frost-covered wood. You brush at it, but the marks cling stubbornly. Later, when you walk the narrow path into the village, you catch the tail end of a whisper between two women by the well. They don't stop talking when you pass, just lower their voices, which is somehow worse. You hear the words omen and last winter, and that's enough to plant the seed. Historically, birds, especially black ones, were tangled in layers of superstition. In medieval Europe, crows and ravens were often seen as harbingers, sometimes of death, sometimes just of change. The quirky bit is that in other places and times, they were seen as wise guides or protectors. Historians still argue whether these mixed interpretations came from ancient folklore bleeding into Christian symbolism, or simply from the fact that crows are everywhere and tend to show up when something's dying. Because, well, they're practical like that. The miller's wife greets you with a smile that doesn't reach her eyes. "Saw a crow near your place?" she says, like it's small talk about the weather. They say it means someone's marked. You laugh politely, but you notice she doesn't take the bread you offer from the basket. On your way home, you pass the chapel. The old priest is sweeping the steps, eyes half-lidded, lips moving in some quiet prayer. He looks up at you for a moment, then down again, as if you're something on the edge of his vision. Back at your cottage, you tend to your goat, scatter feed for the chickens, and try to push away the feeling that the day has shifted under your feet. You remember other times the village has turned on someone, how fast it happens. One day, a neighbor is simply unlucky. The next, they're being questioned about strange footprints in the snow, or why their bread rose too well on a holy day. The sun sinks early. You step outside to bring in firewood, and there's that crow again, on the same fence post. It doesn't move when you approach. You try shooing it away, but it only tilts its head, as if weighing you, then lets out that slow, deliberate caw. The sound echoes in the empty air. You go inside, bolt the door, and tell yourself that tomorrow will be ordinary. But deep down, you already know that in a place like this, ordinary can be a very short season. The next morning, you decide you can't put off the market trip any longer. Bread, salt, and maybe a bit of dried fish if the price isn't too cruel. You've been stretching your stores since the last harvest, But winter will be long, and onions alone can't see you through. The market square is nothing grand, just a scattering of stalls. Some nothing more than a blanket on the ground with goods piled up. The air smells of wood smoke, yeast, and the faint metallic tang of the blacksmith's work. It should feel familiar, even comforting. But today, every sound feels slightly sharpened, laughter cutting shorter than usual, voices turning quieter when you pass. You move toward the baker's stall. He's a broad-shouldered man with a flour-dusted beard, always ready with a joke about his bread being as holy as the priest's sermons. But this morning, he barely meets your eyes as he wraps a loaf in cloth. His hands move faster than usual, like he's eager to be done. Behind you, a cluster of women stand too close, their heads bent together. One of them, Marta, the cooper's wife, lets out a quick little snort of laughter, then bites her lip as soon as you glance over. Historically, market gossip was more than just chatter. It was one of the main ways communities reinforced social boundaries. News traveled faster than any horse when it was carried by the people buying and selling bread. The quirky part? In some villages, the gossip network was so reliable that local authorities used it as a source of information for real investigations. Historians still argue whether these whispers were a form of social control or just human boredom, stretched into something dangerous. You pay for the bread and step aside to tuck it into your basket. That's when the fishmonger's boy, all of 12 years old and clearly enjoying himself, calls out, "Mind the crow doesn't follow you in here." The people around him laugh, not because it's funny, but because it's safe to laugh at you. You force a smile, but your grip on the basket tightens. The cobblestones under your feet seem harder than usual, each step sending a little jolt up your legs. On the way home, you notice that people don't stand in your path anymore. They shift slightly, leaving a gap as you approach. It might be politeness. It might be something else. By the time you reach your cottage, you feel the quiet settling over you like frost. Inside, you set the bread on the table, touch the crust lightly, and think about how a simple trip for food now feels like walking through a crowd that's already decided what kind of person you are. You try to shake it off, busying yourself with chores, splitting kindling, mending a frayed hem, but the memory of those glances clings stubbornly, like smoke in your hair after a fire. Outside, in the bare branches near the fence, the crow waits. Sunday arrives with a brittle chill, the kind that makes even the stones seem to shrink in on themselves. You wrap your shawl tighter, more out of habit than piety. Attendance at Mass isn't exactly optional here. Skipping it would be like painting a target on your back. The chapel smells of beeswax and damp wool, the air heavy with the faint musk of too many bodies crammed into one space. You slip into a bench near the back, the old wood sighing under your weight. From here, you can see the whole congregation, the miller's family in their tidy row, Marta and her friends huddled like sparrows, and the steward's wife with her chin lifted just high enough to suggest she knows she's being looked at. The priest begins with the usual blessings, voice slow and deliberate, like a man measuring each word before letting it loose. Then his tone changes. He speaks of women who walk in darkness, and hearts turned from God by secret whispers in the night. The words aren't names, but they might as well be. You can feel the ripple through the pews, people leaning slightly, eyes shifting in your direction without turning their heads. Historically, Sermons were one of the most effective tools for shaping public opinion in the Middle Ages. A priest didn't have to accuse anyone directly. A well-placed phrase could do the work for him. The quirky twist is that some priests borrowed these warning stories from other towns entirely. Yet villagers still swore they recognized the type being described. Historians still argue whether such sermons were deliberate social targeting or just general moral theater that villagers personalized in unhelpful ways. The candles flicker as the priest leans forward, his shadow stretching across the altar. "And beware," he says, "for the devil seeks the lonely, the grieving, the unguarded." You sit very still. In your mind, you picture the crow on the fence post, the market stairs, the way the baker's hands moved faster than his words. The sermon continues, but you've stopped hearing the details. Only the cadence remains, the slow beat of accusation disguised as warning. When the service ends, the pews creak and bodies shuffle toward the door. A few people murmur the usual farewells, but most slip past you without a glance. Outside, the air is brighter, the sky scrubbed clean by the wind, yet the feeling in your chest is heavy, like you've swallowed a stone. You walk home the long way, skirting the edges of the fields. The cold bites at your cheeks, and the silence between your footsteps feels like the space before a bell tolls. Somewhere ahead, a crow calls. It's barely dusk when the knock comes. 3 sharp raps, quick and businesslike. Outside, the wind is pushing at the shutters, and the fire is just beginning to settle into that low, steady burn. No one visits this time of night unless something's wrong. You open the door to find 3 men from the parish, lanterns in hand. The light throws their faces into sharp relief. One of them, Tomas the cooper, squints as though your doorway is too bright. Another shifts his weight like he'd rather be anywhere else. The third, the steward's nephew, has that polite expression people wear when they're trying to make bad news sound reasonable. "Evening," Tomas says, clearing his throat. "We've had questions about the milk. At first, you think you've misheard. Milk?" But they explain quickly. Several households have had milk curdle overnight, even in the cold, and someone remembered seeing your goat in the lane. That's all it takes. In a place like this, bad luck doesn't float free. It has to be tied to a person. You try to answer plainly, pointing out that goats don't exactly sabotage dairies, but their eyes flicker in that way that says your words are sliding off, not sinking in. Historically, spoiled milk and sour beer were sometimes taken as signs of witchcraft, especially when they happened suddenly across several homes. The quirky part is, medieval people often believed such spoilage could be caused by someone casting the evil eye simply by walking past. Historians still argue whether these beliefs were rooted more in actual superstition or in the practical need to assign blame when food stores went bad. Because blaming magic is much easier than admitting you left the milk in the wrong place. The steward's nephew says they're just here to gather the facts, but his lantern light catches the frost in your yard, and you see the crow's claw marks still etched into the fence post. He follows your gaze. "Best keep the goat penned in," Tomas mutters, as if that will solve everything. Then they're gone, boots crunching on the frozen ground, their lanterns bobbing toward the village like fireflies with an agenda. You shut the door, leaning against it for a moment, listening to the fire crackle. The goat shifts in its stall, giving a low, grumbling bleat. You almost laugh at the absurdity of it, being questioned over dairy, but the sound dies in your throat. You've seen enough to know that absurdity is just the first step toward danger. Outside, the night deepens. Somewhere beyond the forest's edge, the crow calls again. They summon you to the manor 2 days later. The message arrives in the form of a boy you don't recognize. Thin, mud on his boots, hair sticking up like straw. He doesn't meet your eyes when he says, "The steward wants to see you," before running off without waiting for an answer. The manor sits on a slight rise above the village, its walls patched with different shades of stone from repairs over the years. It's not a grand castle, just a big, drafty house with a hall that smells faintly of smoke, tallow, and the damp wool cloaks of whoever passed through that morning. You're led to a long table where the steward sits flanked by 2 men. One you recognize as a bailiff, the other a younger scribe with ink stains on his fingertips. The steward's face is solemn, but there's a gleam in his eyes that you don't like. He clears his throat and begins listing unnatural signs, said to have been witnessed around your home. The crow, the spoiled milk, strange mutterings overheard near your garden. You open your mouth to deny them, but each protest only seems to roll into the next accusation, like stones tumbling downhill. Historically, accusations of witchcraft often relied on a mix of real events and convenient invention. The quirky part is that testimony could come from nearly anyone, neighbor, child, even someone who hadn't seen you in years, and still be taken seriously. Historians still argue whether this openness was meant to encourage community vigilance or simply provided a perfect framework for personal grudges. The scribe writes as the steward speaks, his quill scratching like an insect across the parchment. "You were seen near the well at night," the steward says, "and it is known such places are gateways." You explain you were fetching water after your fire died down, but the bailiff's lips tighten, as if your explanation has only confirmed his suspicion. The steward leans back, folding his hands. "We will speak again," he says, a phrase that feels less like a promise and more like a warning. You leave the hall to find the wind sharper cutting through your shawl as you walk back down toward your cottage. The village feels different from this angle. Roofs hunched together, smoke rising in uneven columns, the fields stretching out like bare, waiting hands. Near the bend in the path, you see it again. The crow, perched on a branch this time, watching. The message doesn't come in words at first. It comes in the way other widows look at you. You catch it in the tilt of their heads, the quick narrowing of their eyes when someone else might be listening, the way they linger in the shadowed corners of the lane. It's mid-morning when Elska, a weaver's widow who lives near the far edge of the village, drifts to your side as you're buying a bundle of kindling. Her voice is low, almost swallowed by the creak of cartwheels and the clop of hooves. "They're talking," she says, not as gossip, but as a fact. She tells you about Greta, how one week she was sitting in the sun spinning flax, and the next she was gone, sent to trial in the next town over. They said she charmed a cow dry. Elska murmurs, no one saw her again. You feel your mouth go dry, but you force a steady tone. "And you?" Elska glances toward the market stalls, then back to you. "I keep quiet. I keep busy. I never speak to anyone twice in the same day if I can help it. But even that..." She lets the words trail off, the unspoken truth hanging there. even that might not save you. Historically, widows made up a disproportionate number of witchcraft accusations in parts of Europe, partly because they had less legal protection. The quirky twist? In some places, widows would form informal alliances, sharing food or quietly defending each other in gossip circles. Yet these networks could just as easily collapse under pressure. Historians still argue whether these alliances were genuine mutual aid or fragile arrangements born out of sheer necessity. Before you part ways, Elska squeezes your hand. "Don't leave your door unbarred at night," she says, "and if they come, don't argue too loud. The rest of the day you go about your chores, mending, feeding the goat, sweeping the hearth, but the warning hums in the back of your mind. You remember Greta, though you only met her twice. You remember the sudden emptiness where her cottage had been, door swinging open as if the house itself was still waiting for her to return. That night, you double bolt your door. The fire burns low, shadows pooling in the corners. Somewhere outside, footsteps crunch on frost, slow and deliberate. You wake to the sound of the rooster, but the rhythm of the village feels different this morning, like a drumbeat that's just slightly off. The air is crisp, the sky a hard winter blue, and from your window you see a cluster of villagers gathered outside the church before the bells have even rung. You try to tell yourself it's nothing. Maybe someone found a stray pig again, but your gut knows better. When you step outside, the smell of wood smoke carries a sharp tang, like burnt cloth, and you hear snippets of conversation that snap shut when you pass. By the time you reach the well, you know the name. Marga, another widow. She's been taken. Someone swore they saw her walking against the wind last night, and that was enough. A woman drawing water tells you the bailiff's men dragged Marga from her bed before dawn. No shoes, no time to even plait her hair. They took her to the old barn, the one they sometimes use for questioning when they want the whole village to hear the screams but not see the faces. Historically, these early morning arrests were common. The element of surprise kept neighbors from gathering in defense and kept the accused from rallying sympathy. The quirky detail? In some towns, they'd bang a particular drum pattern as they dragged someone away, so even the heavy sleepers would know an accusation was in motion. Historians still argue whether the drum beat was meant to warn, to threaten, or to entertain the more bloodthirsty locals. You draw your bucket, the rope rasping against the worn wood, and try to focus on the cold weight in your hands instead of the scene playing in your head. Marga stumbling in the frost, her nightdress catching on brambles, her breath fogging in frantic bursts. Back at home, you stoke the fire and force yourself to knead bread, to hum tunelessly as though the air isn't thick with suspicion. But the loaf comes out heavy, and when you break it apart, the center is still raw, like your thoughts. That night, you dream of the barn doors swinging open and a pale hand slipping out before someone drags it back into the dark. You wake with the taste of ash in your mouth. You try to keep your head down for the next few days, but the village has a way of pulling you into its currents, whether you want to or not. By midweek, you hear that Marga's questioning has turned into something else. People start calling it the proving. That's how they dress it up, like it's some noble trial of truth, instead of what it really is, breaking a woman until she says the words they want. You pass by the barn on the way to gather firewood. The doors are closed, but you can still smell it. That damp, sour scent of straw mixed with unwashed bodies. A pair of men lean against the wall, idly playing dice, guarding nothing but the performance of power. The official story going around is that Marga has admitted to consorting with the black man in the woods, that she danced under the new moon, that she cursed the miller's ox. The truth? You saw Marga limp home from church last month with a bad hip and a prayer book too heavy for her satchel. The truth doesn't weigh much here. A mainstream historical fact. In parts of medieval Europe, confession wasn't just desirable, it was considered essential. Without it, the court's case looked flimsy, and so methods to extract that confession were encouraged. A quirky detail? Some interrogators would pretend to be the accused's friend and slip them wine during questioning, hoping a drunken tongue would spill something damning, or at least something they could twist. Historians still argue whether these friendly tactics were genuinely manipulative or just a way for the interrogators to feel better about themselves. You keep walking, heart drumming, telling yourself you're only going into the woods for kindling, but the deeper you go, the more you feel it, that crawling sensation at the base of your skull, like someone is watching. When you glance back, the path is empty. Still, you can't shake the thought that every step you take is being counted by someone eager to find your footprints in the wrong place at the wrong time. You gather your wood quickly and head home, careful not to hum, careful not to smile at anyone. Around here, joy is suspicious and kindness is worse. If you comfort the wrong person, you risk catching their curse, or at least the rumor of it. And rumors, as you've seen, have sharper teeth than wolves. That night, the wind rattles your shutters, and you lie awake, listening. You tell yourself it's just the weather. But in the pauses between gusts, you swear you can hear Marga's voice, low and hoarse, weaving through the dark. Morning comes pale and heavy, like the sky hasn't quite decided to commit to daylight. You step outside to fetch water, and the first thing you see is the crowd. Not a market day crowd, not a festival crowd. This is a circle of villagers standing stiff, their eyes fixed on something in the square. Marga. She's kneeling on the cobbles, wrists bound in front of her. The ropes look rough enough to bite, and her hair is half unraveled, streaked with something that might be mud, might be worse. You force your gaze away, but the murmurs snake into your ears. She named 3 more. They say one's a widow on the West Road. Didn't she always seem too quiet? That last one makes your skin prickle. You are a widow on the West Road. You are quiet. And here's the thing about quiet in a small medieval village. It's never just quiet. It's a space for others to fill with their own stories about you. And those stories rarely end in your favor. A mainstream historical fact. Many witch trials in medieval Europe relied on spectral evidence. Claims that the accused spirit was seen harming someone, even if they were physically elsewhere. This kind of proof was impossible to disprove and dangerously easy to invent. A quirky tidbit. In some regions, if a woman's butter wouldn't churn properly, it was taken as a sign her neighbor had bewitched her cows. Historians still argue whether these accusations were genuine beliefs or convenient tools to settle petty grudges over fences and goats. One of the bailiffs starts reading a formal charge list, voice booming like a sermon. You notice he says, "by her own confession," after every line. and the crowd nods solemnly, like that makes it real. But you also notice Marga doesn't meet anyone's eyes. She just stares at the ground, lips moving as if she's counting, maybe prayers, maybe heartbeats, until this is over. You back away slowly, clutching the water bucket so hard the handle creaks. But even with your head down, you can feel the shift. Whispers are magnetic. They stick to anyone standing close enough. You pass a knot of women who lean together as you walk by. You don't hear the words, but you know the shape of them. Back home, you bolt the door. It's too early to light candles, but you do anyway, the flames small and nervous in the gloom. You think about bringing Marga bread, something warm, but the thought alone feels dangerous, like holding out your hands to a fire you can't put out. The square will empty soon, but the air will stay thick for days. You can feel it already. Your name rolling on the tongues of people who think they're just passing the time. And somewhere between one candle flicker and the next, you realize you've stopped wondering if they'll come for you. Now, you're wondering when. The next morning, the air feels colder, even though it's the same damp chill that always seeps into your bones this time of year. You don't hear the usual rooster crow from the north side of the village. Rumor says the family there left in the night, packed everything into a cart, and vanished down the road toward the monastery lands. No one runs unless they're sure they're next. You move slowly, stacking kindling by the hearth, trying to make the inside of your home look busy, lived in, useful, as if that might somehow convince the world outside that you have no time for witchcraft. It's absurd, but fear makes absurd things feel like logic. Through the tiny window, you see the bailiff walking with the parish clerk. They're knocking on doors, unrolling scrolls, making notes. You can't hear their words, but you've been here long enough to know the rhythm. Knock, wait, whisper, scratch of the quill. A mainstream historical fact. In many parts of medieval Europe, a formal list of suspects was kept during witch panics, often compiled by both secular and church authorities. Once a name appeared on it, even if no trial followed, the mark on your reputation was almost impossible to erase. A quirky tidbit? In some villages, they believed witches could be detected if you tossed them into a pond with their thumbs tied to opposite toes. If they floated, they were guilty. If they sank, innocent. Of course, the innocent part didn't always save you from drowning first. Historians still argue whether these water tests were taken seriously or performed as theater to reassure the crowd that justice was being done. By midday, the knock comes. It's polite, which makes it worse. The bailiff and the clerk stand framed in your doorway, faces arranged in expressions that pretend at fairness. They don't accuse, not yet. They ask about Marga, about whether she's ever visited you, whether you've ever shared meals or herbs. You answer carefully, your words like stepping stones across a river you know is rising. Then comes the question that makes your stomach drop. Do you live alone? You nod. They exchange a look that isn't written in any law book, but you can read it all the same. Alone is dangerous. Alone means no one to speak for you, no one to confirm your alibi, no one to swear you spent last Thursday mending socks instead of cursing milk. They thank you for your time, tip their heads, and leave. But you know your door isn't a shield anymore, it's just wood, and wood can splinter. That night, You don't light the candles. You sit in the dark, listening to the faint hum of distant voices, the occasional crack of a log from someone else's hearth. Every sound feels amplified, and every pause feels like the breath before a name is spoken, yours. By the time the sun edges over the thatched rooftops, you already know something is wrong. The usual rhythm of the village morning, the thud of buckets against the well rim, the bleating of goats, feels broken, as though everyone has agreed to move in a slower, heavier silence. You step outside, your breath puffing into the air. Across the lane, 3 women are standing together, heads bent close. They don't look up when you pass. That's new. Before, they would have nodded, maybe even asked if you'd spare a sprig of rosemary for their stew. Now, they tighten their shawls and glance sideways at the ground. It's not hard to guess why. A mainstream historical fact. In many late medieval communities, accusations of witchcraft often followed social isolation. When a widow lost the casual exchanges of bread, herbs, or neighborly gossip, she might as well have lost her last defense against suspicion. There's a sudden shout near the market square, sharp enough to carry. You follow the sound, careful to keep to the edge of the street until you see the source. The bailiff stands beside a wooden post, nailing a piece of parchment to it. The wind lifts the edges so you can read the heading. Notice of inquiry. It lists names. Yours is second. The quirky detail that feels almost laughable, if it weren't so grim, is the language. In pursuit of the truth and in service of God, the undersigned call forth the following persons to answer questions regarding matters of maleficium. The capital T in truth curls like a snake, as if the scribe enjoyed decorating your doom. Historians still argue whether such public postings were meant more to summon the accused or to warn the community to keep their distance. The rest of the day unravels in strange fragments. The butcher refuses your coin, muttering something about waiting until this blows over. Children who once chased each other past your door now stop short and cross to the other side of the lane. Back at home, you try to busy yourself with the comfort of small chores, mending the tear in your apron, sweeping the corner where the wind likes to drop twigs. But every task is shadowed by the parchment nailed to that post. At dusk, you hear a knock. Not the official rhythmic knock of the bailiff. This one is softer, almost hesitant. You open the door to find a neighbor's boy, 8, maybe 9 years old, holding a small loaf wrapped in cloth. "Ma'am says you might need this," he whispers, eyes darting to the street. You take it, thank him, and watch him run back home like he's outrunning something invisible. When night comes, you break the loaf in half and eat in silence. The bread tastes of rye and salt, but also of pity. And pity, in a place like this, is almost as dangerous as anger. You lie awake, staring at the rafters, thinking about your name on that parchment. Ink on a page doesn't weigh much, but you feel its pressure all the same, like a stone on your chest. Morning comes, but you barely notice. Sleep was a thin, restless thing, broken by the sound of wind scratching branches against the shutters, and by that other, quieter sound, your own heartbeat, loud in the silence. You don't step outside right away. Instead, you hover at the window, peeking through a gap in the curtain. The lane is emptier than usual, though you can see 2 men walking toward the church, each with a bundle of papers under his arm. One of them glances up, catches your movement, and quickly looks away. By mid-morning, you hear what you've been expecting. The bell at the church tower tolling once, twice, 3 times. That's not the call to Mass. It's the signal for a summons. The mainstream historical fact comes to mind. In late medieval towns, such bells often had coded meanings. Different patterns told you whether there was a fire, a meeting of the guild, or the beginning of an inquiry. And today, it's you they're summoning. You walk toward the square with a pace that's neither hurried nor slow. Too slow, and it's defiance. Too fast, and it's guilt. The cobblestones feel uneven under your boots, though you've walked this way 100 times before. The church door yawns open, and the air inside smells of wax and damp stone. A long table has been set up near the altar, and behind it sit 3 men, 2 local elders and 1 stranger in a dark robe whose eyes flick over you like he's assessing a piece of livestock. They don't ask you to sit. The questions start mild. Where were you on the night of the last new moon? Have you had disputes with any neighbors? But they twist quickly. Have you spoken curses over the sick cow of Tom Weaver? Have you sent ill winds against the mill? A quirky tidbit you recall, oddly enough, is that some interrogators believed a witch's guilt could be confirmed if she hesitated too long before answering, even if she was simply thinking. You feel your throat dry out every time a question comes. Historians still argue whether these early stages were genuine attempts to seek truth or carefully staged performances to set the accused up for failure. The stranger in the robe leans forward. Do you confess? You shake your head, barely daring to speak. The elders exchange glances, then scribble something down. After what feels like hours, they dismiss you with a wave. No verdict yet, just the promise that further inquiry will be made, which is, in plain speech, a warning. This isn't over. Back outside, the air feels colder. The bell is silent now, but its echo still rings in your bones. As you walk home, you notice people pretending to be busy whenever you pass, adjusting baskets, tying shoelaces, staring at clouds. No one meets your eye. At your door, you pause. The loaf from last night still sits on the table. You tear off a piece, chew without tasting, and wonder if the boy's mother will risk another gift, or if she's already thinking it's safer to keep her distance. The knock comes sooner than you'd hoped, mid-afternoon, when the light is still bright enough to show every crack in the doorframe and every hesitation in your face. You don't open it right away. 3 knocks, deliberate, spaced just long enough to feel like they're tapping directly against your nerves. When you finally pull the latch, 2 men stand there. One is the elder you saw at the table earlier. The other is younger, wearing a leather satchel across his chest. He's holding a small book and a quill. Scribes in this town are not there for your benefit. They're there to make your words permanent. The elder clears his throat. We will search the house. You don't step aside. That earns you a sharp look. Hesitation itself is suspicious. So you move, and they enter, bringing with them a draft of cold air and the faint smell of tallow from the candles they carry. Mainstream historical fact. In the late Middle Ages, a witch's guilt could be proven through the discovery of so-called witch marks. Odd scars, moles, or even strange knots in cloth that were claimed to be talismans. A hairbrush dropped under the bed could be enough to damn you if they chose to see it that way. They begin with the main room, moving aside the few pots you own, lifting the lid of the flour jar, glancing at the loaf on the table. The scribe pauses to jot notes each time something seems unusual, though unusual feels dangerously elastic today. Then they move to your sleeping corner. The elder leans low, examining the woven blanket your late husband made. His fingers brush against the rough patch you mended months ago, and for a moment you think he might call it some sort of binding spell. He doesn't, but the scribe still writes something down. A quirky tidbit drifts up from your memory. Some towns believed cats were the familiars of witches, but others, strangely, thought they were protectors against evil spirits. Here, you aren't sure which belief holds sway, but you're glad your own cat vanished last winter. One less shadow for them to point at. Historians still argue whether searches like this were sincere attempts to collect evidence or simply ways to intimidate and remind the accused of their helplessness. When they finish, the elder straightens and says nothing. The scribe closes his book, and they both walk out without so much as a farewell. You follow them to the door and watch them leave, their boots crunching over frost. You don't know whether to feel relieved they took nothing or afraid they might still have found exactly what they were looking for, even if it was only in their own minds. The afternoon passes with a strange quiet. You try to return to the small chores of your day, but your ears keep straining for footsteps. You find yourself looking at every corner of your home as though seeing it through their eyes, wondering which ordinary object could be turned into a weapon against you next. By nightfall, you've learned a cruel truth. You're no longer living in your own house. You're living in evidence. You don't sleep that night. Not really. You drift in and out, waking at every creak of the rafters and every groan of the wind against the shutters. The frost outside has deepened, and the cold seeps up through the floorboards. You pull your blanket tighter, but the chill isn't just from the air. When the first light creeps in, you try to busy yourself, fetching water from the well, feeding the hens. But your mind keeps circling back to the silent question. When will they come back? By mid-morning, the question is answered. The elder returns, this time alone, holding a folded piece of parchment. He doesn't bother with pleasantries. He hands you the paper, and you see your name written in a script you can barely read. Below it, a command. You are to appear before the town's examining panel tomorrow. Your heart hammers in your ears. This isn't a trial yet, not officially. It's the questioning stage. But in this place, everyone knows questioning is the antechamber to condemnation. Mainstream historical fact. Across Europe, so-called preliminary examinations in witchcraft cases often relied heavily on the accused's own statements. Even the smallest inconsistency could be twisted into an admission. Entire cases were built on nothing more than nervous stammering. The elder watches you read, or pretend to read, the summons. Then he delivers the part that's not written down. If you speak plainly and confess what you know, mercy may be shown. You wonder what mercy means in his mouth. Less time in the stocks, a faster death, a quirky tidbit from another region drifts into your mind. Some towns believe that simply baking bread in the wrong phase of the moon was proof enough to suspect witchcraft. That memory sits uncomfortably alongside the fact that your last loaf was baked on the dark of the moon, though not on purpose. Historians still argue whether mercy offers like this were genuine, meant to spare lives, or simply bait to extract confessions and names of others to accuse. After he leaves, you sit at your table and stare at the summons. The ink has bled slightly into the fibers, making the letters seem alive, as though they might slither off the page and wrap around your wrists. The rest of the day you find yourself rehearsing answers in your head. You imagine the panel, 3 men, maybe 4, asking where you were on certain nights, who visits your home, what you speak of when no one is listening. You try to plan your words so they can't be twisted, but each sentence you shape seems to carry hidden traps. By sunset, you stop rehearsing. You realize the truth. No matter how careful you are, they can make your words mean whatever they want. The hens roost early in the cold. You light your one candle and sit beside it, watching the wax pool at its base. Tomorrow, you will walk into the hall where verdicts are shaped, though they won't call it that. They will call it hearing your side. But you already know your side isn't the one they've come to hear. Morning comes with a sky the color of dirty wool. Your breath clouds the air as you step outside, a small bundle of food tucked under your arm, more out of habit than hope. The path to the hall winds through the village square, and you feel the weight of every glance. Some neighbors nod stiffly, others pretend not to see you at all. The hall itself is colder than the street, built from stone that seems to hoard the damp. You're ushered inside by a young man you've never seen before, his face as blank as the frost on the windows. There they are, 3 men seated behind a long table, the elder in the center. On either side of him, a merchant and a minor landholder, men with no legal training, but plenty of opinions, mainstream historical fact. In many medieval towns, witchcraft hearings were held before local officials with little to no judicial experience. These panels relied heavily on common sense and community knowledge, which often meant personal grudges had as much weight as evidence. They don't invite you to sit. Instead, you stand in the middle of the room, the boards creaking under your boots. The questions begin gently enough. How long have you lived here? Who were your parents? What do you do to earn your keep? But soon, the tone shifts. They ask about your late husband's death. Was it sudden? Did he suffer strange pains? Was there a quarrel before he passed? You answer each one, feeling your words scatter like dry leaves in the wind. A quirky tidbit slips into your mind. In one village, a widow was accused because a cat jumped on her roof at night. The villagers insisted the cat was her familiar, and she was said to have sent it to steal the mayor's dreams. Historians still argue whether such accusations were believed literally or used as metaphorical proof of a dangerous reputation. Here, they're less fanciful, but no less sharp. They bring up the sick child you once tended, who later died. They mention your garden, the herbs you grow. Why do you know which plants ease pain? One asks, leaning forward as if you might reveal the devil's own recipe. Your mouth is dry. You try to explain that your mother taught you, that it's nothing more than tradition. But you can feel the balance shifting. Each answer seems to dig you in deeper. When you falter, the elder says, "We're here to help you speak the truth." Sometimes, in cases like this, people forget the details, especially if they've been influenced. His pause stretches, and the air between you feels heavy. By the time they wave you away, Your knees are trembling. You step outside into the thin daylight, lungs filling with cold air, and you realize you've given them nothing. Nothing but what they already had. And yet, that may be enough. The day drags on, each hour stretching like poorly spun wool. You stay in your cottage, trying to keep your hands busy, mending a hem, grinding dried fennel, but the needle trembles in your fingers, and the pestle clacks too loud against the mortar. Every sound feels like a knock at the door. By mid-afternoon, the knock finally comes. It's not the constable this time, but Marta, your neighbor, with the crooked smile and sharper tongue. She doesn't step inside, only leans halfway through the doorway as though afraid to share the air. "I thought you should know," she says, voice low. "They've sent for the old women from the next parish." Your stomach turns. The old women aren't midwives or healers. They're the so-called wise witnesses, known for sniffing out the devil's mark. Mainstream historical fact. In parts of medieval Europe, suspected witches were examined for unusual skin blemishes, thought to be places where a familiar spirit had fed. These inspections were carried out by women appointed by the court, but their methods were invasive and humiliating. Marta adds, "They'll search everywhere, even the bottoms of your feet." She says it almost with relish, as if the gossip tastes sweeter than pity. You try to thank her for the warning, but the words stick in your throat. When she's gone, you sit in silence, tracing your own hands, your arms, as if to memorize every freckle and scar. The truth is, you do have odd marks. Who doesn't, after years of work in sun and frost? A pale patch near your elbow from a long-healed burn. A small, dark mole just behind your left knee. You picture the wise women leaning in, declaring these proof of your pact with the devil. A quirky tidbit floats to mind, absurd and awful at once. In one trial, a woman's guilt was confirmed because a pimple near her collarbone failed to bleed when pricked with a needle. It later turned out the needle had a retractable tip, crafted by a local carpenter who liked to help the accusers win their cases. Historians still argue whether such tools were part of a deliberate conspiracy or merely theatrical stagecraft meant to terrify the accused into confessing. As the light fades, you light a single candle, letting the shadows crowd the corners. You think of running, just slipping away into the dark fields, walking until the fear burns out of you. But the winter nights are bitter, and you have nowhere to go. When you finally lie down, sleep comes in fits, tangled with dreams of fingers prodding your skin, searching for secrets you never had to begin with. Morning brings no relief, only a sky the color of pewter and the slow crunch of footsteps on frost outside your door. You don't have to open it to know they've come. Two of them, both wrapped in heavy wool shawls, step inside without asking. One is stooped with age, but moves with a predator's precision. The other is tall and thin, her face sharp as a knife blade. They smell faintly of smoke and rosemary, a mix that might have been comforting in another life. They say nothing about your home, though you notice their eyes flicking over your shelves, the bundles of dried herbs, the jar of goose fat on the hearth. One gestures to a stool. Sit. Mainstream historical fact. Accused women in the late Middle Ages were often subjected to witch pricking and full-body searches. The theory was that the devil's mark would feel numb and wouldn't bleed when punctured. The practice was not only degrading, but also deeply flawed, often manipulated to ensure a guilty finding. The tall one takes out a pin, long and thin, gleaming faintly in the dim light. You watch her hands, trying to decide whether they're shaking from age or from eagerness. Your mind skips to a strange fringe tidbit you once overheard from a traveling tinker, that some witch finders carried hollow needles that left no mark, perfect for declaring a spot insensible. He'd laughed when he told it, as if it were a tavern joke, not a weapon used to ruin lives. The shorter woman starts at your neck, pushing your hair aside to inspect the skin beneath. She murmurs to herself, prodding here, pinching there. You want to tell her that the freckle by your ear has been there since you were a girl, that the rough patch on your shoulder came from a cooking fire years ago. But you know how useless that would be. They move lower, brisk and businesslike, yet somehow each touch feels colder than the winter air. The tall one pricks your forearm. A bead of blood wells up. She says, almost disappointed. Historians still argue whether these inspections were genuinely believed to reveal witchcraft, or if they were little more than a ritualized humiliation meant to break the accused. By the time they're done, you feel smaller somehow, as though they've taken not just your dignity, but part of your skin with them. They leave without a word of judgment, but you know better than to take that as mercy. You stay seated long after the door shuts, hands folded tightly in your lap. Outside, somewhere in the village, someone will already be telling someone else about the mole behind your knee, the one you've never thought about until now. And just like that, a harmless speck becomes a seed of death. By dusk, you hear the sound of chopping wood outside, though no one in your household has a reason to be splitting logs. When you peek through the slat in your shutters, you see 3 men, all young enough to be brash and old enough to be dangerous, standing near the edge of your yard. They're laughing about something, but their eyes keep darting toward your door. It's the smell that hits you first when you step outside. The bitter tang of green wood burning too soon, mixed with the faintest whiff of pitch. You don't have to ask what it's for. You've heard enough stories to know. Dry wood burns quick. Green wood smolders long. Mainstream historical fact. In parts of medieval Europe, witches were often burned at the stake not just for execution, but as a public deterrent. Sometimes the wood was deliberately chosen to prolong the agony. A grim theater designed for the crowd. They don't hide what they're doing. One of them even tips his hat to you, a mockery of civility. Making preparations, he says, as if he were building a maypole for midsummer. You try to tell yourself it's just intimidation, that no one has formally convicted you yet. But intimidation often isn't a prelude here, it's the process itself. A fringe tidbit bubbles up in your mind. You once overheard a peddler claiming that in certain villages, condemned women were bound with ropes soaked in vinegar to cleanse the soul as it burned. You don't know if it's true, but the image is enough to make your knees feel weak. You step closer to the men, forcing your voice steady. "Wood for the baker?" you ask lightly. They smirk. Something like that. Historians still argue whether these early preparations were a form of psychological warfare meant to push a confession or simply part of the community's macabre readiness for public punishment. Either way, you know the smell of pitch will cling to your clothes long after this evening ends. When you turn to go back inside, you feel the heat of their eyes on your back. The sound of the axe resuming its work follows you like a heartbeat, steady and inevitable. Inside, the fire in your hearth has burned low, and for the first time, you let it die. Night falls thicker than usual, as if the darkness itself knows what's brewing. You sit by the unlit hearth, listening to the faint creaks of the house settling. Only some of those creaks aren't the timber. The knock comes not as a polite rap, but as 3 hard thuds, slow enough to be deliberate. When you open the door, the bailiff is there, flanked by 2 others carrying lanterns. The light makes the shadows on their faces longer, more angular, like masks. He announces himself as if you hadn't seen his face before in the market. "We have a warrant," he says, producing a parchment that smells faintly of damp and smoke. You don't need to read the words to know what they mean. The charges are formal now. Mainstream historical fact. During medieval witch trials, an arrest warrant was often just a piece of parchment with your name and the word sorceress or malefica scrawled upon it, enough to justify imprisonment without immediate trial. One of the men glances into your house, eyes darting like a magpie's, taking stock of your belongings. You recall the whispered stories that some witch hunters kept the property of the accused for the church, they'd say, though the silver spoons seemed to find their way into private cupboards. A fringe tidbit comes to mind. There were villages where the accused were taken not to a formal cell, but to the home of a watcher. Someone paid in bread and beer to keep them locked in a back room until the trial. Some claimed this was more humane. Others noted it meant you were trapped within earshot of your accusers day and night. Historians still argue whether these community arrests were genuinely meant to give the accused a chance to speak in their own defense, or simply to let the rumor mill grind even finer before the inevitable sentence. You ask if you can at least bring your shawl, though your voice betrays the tremor in your chest. One of the men hands you your own cloak, but keeps hold of your arm as if you might bolt into the night. The village looks different when seen from between 2 lanterns. Shadows seem deeper, corners sharper. Doors that you know are unlocked suddenly feel shut forever. When they lead you past the square, you notice something you hadn't before. A neat pile of green wood stacked near the fountain, just high enough to catch a crowd's eye. It isn't waiting for winter, it's waiting for you. They take you to a squat stone building at the far end of the village, a place you've always thought of as a grain store, though the thick iron-banded door suggests otherwise. The key the bailiff produces is heavy enough to be used as a weapon. Inside, the air is a stale mixture of straw dust, cold stone, and something metallic that clings to your tongue. There's a single window, high and narrow, letting in a blade of moonlight. The floor is uneven, as though it has sagged under the weight of all the people who've sat here before you. They don't bind your hands, which somehow feels worse because it means they believe you have nowhere to go. One of the men points toward a pile of straw in the corner as if that's the height of comfort. "Rest," he says, and you can't tell if he's mocking you or genuinely doesn't see the cruelty in the suggestion. Mainstream historical fact. Many medieval holding cells were converted barns, sheds, or storage rooms. They weren't intended for long-term imprisonment, but trials could be delayed for weeks, meaning people spent far longer in them than the law prescribed. You lie on the straw, but it's filled with tiny burrs that prick through your skirt. The sound of rats moving in the walls reminds you that in some places, being locked up was as much a danger to your health as any accusation. Fleas, lice, and illness often claimed prisoners before the trial ever did. A fringe tidbit surfaces in your mind. In one German town, it was believed that witches could slip out of their cells by turning into moths. So jailers kept candles burning all night, hoping to lure such escapees to their deaths in the flame. You glance toward the single stub of tallow candle on the far wall and wonder whether that's its true purpose. Historians still argue whether this belief in shape-shifting was actually widespread, or whether it was a convenient excuse for guards who lost prisoners and needed a supernatural explanation. The night stretches long. You doze only in shreds, waking each time the door's latch clicks as the guards trade shifts. The rhythm of their boots on the stones outside becomes your clock. At some point before dawn, you hear voices, women's voices, just outside the door. You catch only fragments. Best keep her. Can't take chances. Widow like her. The words, widow like her, burn into you more than the cold ever could. By morning, you understand that the cell isn't just a place to wait for trial. It's a stage, and you've already been cast in the role. The next day, they let you out, not to walk free, but to face the hall where the village gathers for matters of justice. The sky is a washed-out gray, the kind that gives no clue whether it's about to rain or simply mock you with endless cloud. You shuffle along the muddy lane, every eye tracking you. It's not the crowd's silence that unnerves you. It's the murmur, the quiet hum of whispered speculation that follows in your wake like a swarm of flies. Children clutch their mother's skirts, and you can almost see the moment they're told not to get too close, as if whatever you have might rub off. The hall is smaller than you imagined. Long trestle tables run along each side, and a single chair, higher than the others, waits at the far end. The man who sits in it is neither noble nor priest, just the magistrate elected by those who already think you guilty. Mainstream historical fact. Local justice in much of medieval Europe was often handled by such community-appointed officials, whose judgments could be heavily swayed by personal relationships or the prevailing mood of the crowd. You're told to stand in the center. Your hands fold automatically in front of you, the universal stance of the accused. The magistrate's voice is calm, almost casual, as he reads the charges. You hear words like suspicion, maleficium, and unnatural influence. But it's suspicion that sticks, because suspicion requires no proof, only belief. From somewhere behind you, a voice calls out that your cow's milk turned sour last month. Another says your herb garden grows better than anyone else's, and that alone is unnatural. You almost laugh. How dare you keep plants alive? Fringe tidbit. In some parts of England, keeping bees was once considered suspicious if you were unmarried or widowed. The idea being that bees responded only to those who used special words to control them. You don't even keep bees, but you suspect the logic here would make little distinction. Historians still argue whether these accusations were born of genuine fear of witchcraft or simply as a social weapon, an easy way to remove someone inconvenient, like a widow who managed her own land. The questioning begins. It's less an inquiry than a litany of rumors, each one presented as though it were fact. They ask why you were in the forest last week. You answer, for firewood. They ask why you collect herbs. You answer, for cooking and healing. Every answer feels like another step deeper into a bog. You can't tell which reply will sink you entirely. When they pause, the silence is not relief, but a warning. You can feel the verdict settling in the air like a storm about to break. They don't announce the verdict right away. That would be too merciful. Instead, you're led outside again, where the air feels sharp enough to cut. A wind has picked up, carrying the smell of wet earth and wood smoke. The villagers cluster together in knots, some glancing your way and then quickly looking elsewhere, others staring as if willing you to burst into flames on the spot. You're not sure if it's the cold or the knowledge of what's coming that makes your hands tremble. The magistrate eventually steps out, accompanied by the priest and 2 men from the watch. His voice is level, but loud enough for everyone to hear. You will undergo a test. If you are innocent, the test will show it. If not, well, they leave that part to the imagination. Mainstream historical fact, trial by ordeal was a real judicial practice in parts of medieval Europe, used not only for suspected witches, but for theft, murder, and other accusations. The idea was that divine intervention would reveal the truth, either by protecting the innocent or allowing harm to befall the guilty. Today's ordeal is water. You'll be bound and lowered into the river. If you sink, you're innocent. If you float, you're guilty. Yes, you note the logical flaw immediately. One outcome drowns you, the other gets you executed. It's a lose-lose that would make any modern lawyer's eye twitch. Fringe tidbit. In some regions, they used blessed water for this ritual, believing that pure water would reject the guilty and refuse to accept them into its depths. You privately wonder if your village even bothers with the blessing, or if this is just the same muddy water you've been fetching for years. Historians still argue whether communities truly believed these ordeals were foolproof, or if they were simply a convenient way to let nature or chance decide the messy business of punishment. The crowd walks with you toward the riverbank, the sound of feet on damp soil blending with the steady rush of water ahead. Children are hoisted onto shoulders for a better view. Entertainment and moral lesson rolled into one. The rope is rough against your wrists. The men binding you avoid your eyes. You could swear their hands shake, though whether from pity or fear, you can't tell. The river's surface glitters with cold sunlight, looking almost inviting until the wind shifts and the smell of silt hits you. A final murmur of prayer, more for themselves than for you, and you're lowered in. The shock of the water steals your breath, and you fight the instinct to thrash. Somewhere above, voices shout, some urging you to sink, others to rise. Your fate hangs, absurdly, on whether water likes you today. The water closes over your head like a cold fist. For a second, there's no sound except the bubbling rush in your ears. No sight, but the murky brown blur. Your lung seize, and your body screams to surface. But you remember the logic of this so-called test. Sinking means innocent. Floating means guilty. In this upside-down moral universe, drowning is the only way to live. You force your limbs still, let yourself drop deeper, the rope tugging at your shoulders. The riverbed rises up faster than you expect, soft silt swallowing your toes. You dig in, half praying no one notices how quickly you went down. Mainstream historical fact. Medieval ordeal water tests often bound suspects in a specific way, right thumb to left big toe, left thumb to right big toe, to make movement nearly impossible. It was meant to keep people from cheating their way to innocence. In reality, it mostly made survival harder. From above, you hear muffled shouts. Someone must be counting, deciding how long is long enough before hauling you up. Your chest is on fire now, every heartbeat booming in your skull. Fringe tidbit. There are scattered records of people faking the test's results by bribing those holding the rope. A subtle tug could keep you from floating, while an enemy could jerk you upward just as you started to sink. Medieval justice wasn't just dangerous, it was negotiable for the right price. Historians still argue whether these tests were intended to be survivable or whether the point was simply to stage a convincing performance before a predetermined execution. When they finally yank you back into the daylight, you collapse onto the mud, coughing river water. You hear mutters ripple through the crowd, some astonished you sank so quickly, others muttering that Satan's hand could drag anyone down if he wanted. The priest's eyes are hard. He says nothing about innocence. Instead, he announces a retrial tomorrow, just to be certain. You're hauled upright, dripping and shivering. The crowd parts reluctantly, the wet slap of your skirts marking your walk back toward the cell. You catch the gaze of one woman you once called a friend, her lips pressed so tight they're almost white. Whether she pities you or condemns you, you can't tell. The river's chill clings to you long after the door slams shut. Morning comes with the damp smell of straw and mildew and the faintest gold sliver of sunlight sneaking through the barred window. Your body aches from the cold river test, but the real pain sits lower, in the pit of your stomach. You know today isn't truly a retrial. It's a final performance, staged to convince everyone, including those already convinced that the verdict was inevitable. They lead you out again, ropes biting at your wrists. The square is smaller than it felt on your first day here, crowded faces pressing in like the walls of a closing tunnel. You keep your gaze forward. Looking at them would only feed the part of you that wants to scream. Mainstream historical fact. In many medieval towns, witch trials weren't just legal proceedings. They were public events, part cautionary tale, part entertainment. People sold food and drink at executions, turning human misery into a marketplace. Someone hands the priest a paper, though you know he doesn't need to read it. The words are already etched in his mind. You listen as he repeats the charges: speaking to animals, walking alone at night, surviving illness others did not. Each crime feels absurd enough to laugh at. If only laughter didn't stick in your throat like a bone. Fringe tidbit. In certain parts of Europe, widows were disproportionately accused of witchcraft, not just because they lacked a man's protection, but because their property became easier to claim once they were gone. Trials could be as much about land as about the devil. Historians still argue whether ordinary villagers truly believed in all the accusations or whether belief was just a convenient mask for greed, fear, and old grudges. Your sentence is read aloud. The crowd shifts, not with surprise, but with the quiet satisfaction of a play reaching its final act. The priest asks if you confess. You tell him no. The murmurs grow. He nods anyway, as if your answer was only a formality. They march you toward the stake. The wood is piled high, the air heavy with resin and smoke from earlier fires. You feel each heartbeat slower now, like the moments are stretching, thinning, fading. There's no dramatic lightning bolt, no whispered spell, no black cat to leap in your defense, only the steady breath in your lungs and the quiet thought that you have done nothing wrong. The ropes are tied, the kindling crackles, the crowd's faces blur into a single shape. And somewhere deep in that heat, before it reaches you, the world begins to drift away. Slowly, softly, like a candle flame bending before it goes out. And now, as the noise of the crowd fades, you find yourself somewhere quieter. The cobblestones are gone, replaced by the soft whisper of grass under your feet. The air smells of summer rain, not smoke. A stream murmurs nearby, cool and clear, its ripples catching the last light of the day. Here, no one points, no one whispers. There are no ropes on your wrists, no accusations in the air. Only the slow sway of trees, the soft brush of leaves overhead, and the warmth of a sun that has nothing to burn away. Your breathing settles into an easy rhythm. You feel the tension loosen from your shoulders, the weight of all those eyes finally lifting. It's just you, the earth beneath you, and the slow turning of the sky. If you listen, you can almost hear the voices of other women, some real, some imagined, who walked before you, who carried their own unfair burdens. They are lighter now, free from the chains of a world that misunderstood them. And in this moment, you realize you are too. The wind moves gently across your face, carrying the faintest scent of wildflowers. Somewhere a bird calls, then another. The sound is unhurried, patient, like there's no end to the time you have here. So you let yourself sit, feeling the grass curl around your fingers, the ground holding you steady. You close your eyes. For a moment, the past is just a distant ripple, the future an open field. And as the last rays of daylight fade into the calm hush of evening, you feel that steady peace wrap around you like a blanket. You are safe now. You are free. If you're still awake, don't worry. We'll be right here with you tonight. Let's head into our second story together. Hey guys, tonight we step into a world where the candlelight flickers against stone walls, and the air smells faintly of wood smoke and damp earth. You're standing in a medieval church, your hand resting in another's as vows are exchanged. Not in the romantic, heart-thumping way the movies promise, but in that ceremonial, everybody's staring, I hope I don't trip on my dress sort of way. Outside, the bells toll in uneven rhythm, and the village turns to watch you walk past, a small smile fixed on your face. The sky is low and gray, the kind that promises rain, but can't be bothered to deliver. It's supposed to be the happiest day of your life, and yet, even now, there's that faint, nagging prickle between your shoulder blades, like someone's watching with more calculation than joy. You probably won't survive this, literally. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? Drop your location and local time down below. It's always fascinating to see where this little community stretches across the globe. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The vows are said, the feast begins, and you're ushered to a table set with trenchers of bread and cheese, a modest roast bird in the center. people call you fortunate. But in truth, your marriage was arranged more out of convenience than romance. Your family lost much in the last bad harvest, and his had grain to spare. It's a transaction in wedding garb, one that looks pretty enough to outsiders. Your new husband sits beside you, laughing easily with his brothers. At first glance, his attention seems warm. He passes you a slice of meat, pours you a cup of watered wine. But there's something in the way he measures your plate before setting it down, as though mentally keeping account of what you take. Medieval weddings weren't all love and lace. Historically, many unions in small villages were alliances to consolidate land or goods. The church recorded them, but affection was optional. In fact, in some parts of Europe, couples could be betrothed simply by exchanging a promise in front of witnesses. No church ceremony, no gowns, just a handshake and the looming reality of lifelong partnership. For you, the arrangement means leaving behind the familiar patch of your parents' farm for your husband's home on the edge of the village. His family's house is larger, 2 rooms instead of 1, with a small loft above the main hall where the grain is stored. But you notice, on your very first night, how the loft door has a lock, and you do not have the key. The weeks pass with their slow medieval rhythm, tending chickens, stirring pots over the hearth, patching clothes, sweeping the earthen floor until it's more mud than dust. You try to make the space feel like your own, but every time you shift a stool or hang your cloak in a new spot, you catch your husband looking, not annoyed exactly, but assessing. And here's where the fringe detail comes in. In certain medieval households, it wasn't uncommon for a husband to keep a marital ledger, an actual book or parchment where he'd note expenses, yields, and sometimes even his wife's behavior. Historians still argue whether these were mostly for estate management or quietly doubling as tools of control. You begin to notice other things, too. His cousin, a wiry man with darting eyes, comes by more often than seems necessary, always finding an excuse to glance at the loft. His mother, who once welcomed you with a smile, now folds her arms tighter across her chest whenever you speak. You tell yourself it's just newness, new roles, new people, new unspoken rules. But that prickling between your shoulder blades never really goes away. Then there's the oddest moment of all. One evening, as you stand outside to shake crumbs from a cloth, you overhear a scrap of conversation between your husband and the cousin. The cousin says something about timing it before the winter frost, and your husband laughs, low and satisfied. The words mean nothing specific, but the tone does. It's the kind of laugh that's meant for agreements, not jokes. You shrug it off for now, but you'll remember it later when the air is colder and the church bells ring not for weddings, but for trials. The autumn sun is dingier now, rising late and setting early, casting long, sharp shadows across the yard. You've settled into the marriage as best you can, though settled is a generous word for the constant low hum of unease in your chest. The mornings start before dawn, stoking the hearth, hauling water from the well, kneading dough until your arms ache. Your husband's demands are always simple, but they carry the weight of expectation. One morning, as you're setting out his breakfast, he makes an offhand comment about the hens not laying enough. His voice is casual, but the glance he gives you is sharp enough to slice bread. You murmur something about the weather turning cold, but the expression on his face doesn't soften. In medieval villages, a wife's duties were as much about managing the household's productivity as they were about companionship. Fail to keep the hens laying, the butter churning, or the herbs stocked, and people whispered, sometimes about incompetence, sometimes about curses. The two weren't as far apart in the popular imagination as you'd hope. You keep busy, tending the herbs that cling to life in the kitchen garden, drying rosemary and sage for winter stews. It's on one of these afternoons, crouched among brittle stems, that you notice the neighbor, an older woman with a scarf pulled tight under her chin, watching you from across the fence. She says nothing, just watches, her eyes flicking from your hands to your face. When you wave, she turns away. There's a certain superstition about women who know plants. The line between good wife who heals and witch who harms could be razor thin. You remember your mother's warning, never give a remedy without being asked and never accept payment for it, or people might say you're selling magic. Later that week, you're making a poultice for your husband's blistered hand. He'd burned it shifting a log in the hearth when his cousin walks in. His eyes go straight to the bowl in your lap, to the green paste you're spreading on linen strips. He tilts his head, smirks, and says, "You learned that from your mother?" You nod, keeping your tone polite, but there's something in his smile that makes you want to dump the whole thing in the fire. Historians still argue whether most witchcraft accusations began as genuine fear or as convenient weapons. Either way, you can feel the balance shifting like a tightrope swaying underfoot. The cousin lingers, asking questions about how it works, his voice too curious, too deliberate. You answer as vaguely as possible, aware that the walls in a small village have ears. That night, you wake to the sound of hushed voices in the main room, your husband's and the cousin's again. You can't catch every word, but you hear your own name and then something about a way to be rid of her without losing the grain. Your breath catches. It's not just a passing cruelty now, it's strategy. And in a world where whispers can become charges and charges can become rope, that's the kind of strategy you don't survive. You lie back down, staring into the dark, the weight of the loft door's locked key pressing into your thoughts. Whatever they're keeping from you, it's not grain alone. The letter comes on a rainy afternoon, delivered by a boy whose boots are caked with mud. You wipe your hands on your apron before taking it, feeling the paper soft with damp. Your husband breaks the wax seal with his thumb, scanning the words without reading them aloud. Then he looks up, his face a careful mask, and says, "My uncle in the next county has died." You offer condolences, but his tone tells you it's not grief he's feeling. When he adds, he left his holdings to family, you feel a flicker of unease. Inheritance in the Middle Ages wasn't as simple as handing over a will. Disputes could drag for years, and property, especially land, was worth more than gold. Your husband doesn't specify who the family is, but later you hear him speaking with a merchant in the village square about boundaries and transfer rights. When you finally learn the truth through a loose-lipped niece, it's worse than you imagined. The uncle left part of the estate to you, not to your husband, to you, in your own name. A stretch of fertile farmland, a mill with steady income. In theory, a woman could hold property independently if it was gifted or inherited. though in practice husbands often claimed control. That night at supper, he's quiet. He chews slowly, eyes never quite meeting yours. The candle between you spits and hisses as if trying to fill the silence. The next few weeks, the air in the house changes. His temper grows short over the smallest things: damp wood, burnt porridge, a missing spoon. When you try to speak of the inheritance, he waves you off, muttering that you wouldn't know what to do with it anyway. Historians still argue whether greed or genuine superstition fueled more witchcraft accusations. In cases like yours, the two were often inseparable. Owning property without a man's oversight could mark you as unnatural, and unnatural women were dangerous. One afternoon, you'll find a crude carving scratched into the lintel above your door, a circle with jagged lines radiating out. You've seen it before on barns to ward off bad luck. But here, in plain view, it's an accusation, a quiet warning to others. This house may harbor something unholy. The neighbor with the scarf starts crossing herself when you pass. The baker's wife stops offering you extra crusts of bread. Even the children who used to chase your geese for sport now avoid the yard entirely. You overhear two women whispering near the well. One says she's heard of wives who drain a man's fortune with charms and curses. The other says she's certain you've been blessed by the devil to inherit what rightly should go to your husband. They don't notice you listening, your hands still wet from the bucket rope. By evening, you catch your husband watching you from the doorway as you knead dough. His expression isn't angry exactly, it's calculating, like a man considering the price of something and whether it's worth selling. You've begun to understand, in this place, in this time, wealth doesn't just make you comfortable, it makes you a target. And the easiest way to strip a woman of it is to make her something less than human. It begins with a chicken, not one of yours. Your hens are healthy and laying, but the one belonging to Mistress Laura down the lane. You hear her shrieking before you see her, voice slicing through the stillness of a spring morning. When you arrive, she's standing over a limp, white-feathered body, wringing her hands. The bird's eyes are clouded, its beak open as if mid-protest. "She was fine last night," Laura says loudly, making sure the two boys loitering nearby can hear. "Then I saw you passing my fence after dark. You blink. Yes, you passed her fence, because the lane curves there, and it's the only way to the mill. But your explanation dies on your tongue. You already know this won't be a conversation. It will be a seed, and seeds in this village take root quickly. By midday, someone has added to the tale. Now it's not just that you walked past Laura's fence. It's that you were muttering. Words not fit for a Christian tongue, says old Nan at the well, whose hearing is about as sharp as a butter knife. By supper, the muttering has become a chant. By morning, a chant has become a curse. Historians still argue whether these omens were genuine fears or convenient tools for settling personal scores. In your case, the timing feels far too tidy. The moment your husband learned the property was legally yours, people started remembering peculiar things. A miller's wife claims she saw you leaving a sprig of rowan on her door, protection against evil, except now it's twisted into a sign that you're marking your next victim. A farmer swears you stared too long at his newborn calf, and days later, the calf was dead. Even the priest mentions, gently but with that tone, how unusual it is for a woman to walk alone so often. Not sinful, he says, smiling faintly, but people talk. It's almost laughable, if not for the way people step back when you pass. Their eyes are curious, wary, like they're waiting to see if your shadow behaves differently from theirs. Your husband doesn't defend you. In fact, he starts repeating these rumors in his own measured way, shaking his head as though he hates to say it, but feels duty-bound. She's been restless lately, he tells the baker, keeps odd hours, talks to herself sometimes. These are things any human does, but when said in the right tone, they transform into proof. The first time you realize he's actively feeding the gossip, you feel something cold settle in your chest. He wants the village to believe you're dangerous, because dangerous women lose their rights. That evening, as you draw water from the bucket, you think about how quickly this is moving. 1 week ago, you were simply the wife who baked good bread and kept her geese from wandering. Now, you're the wife who might poison a neighbor's chicken with just a glance. You try to tell yourself that reason will win out. After all, you've harmed no one. But deep down, you've begun to understand the cruel truth of your time. Innocence isn't a shield when someone else writes the story of your life. The meeting is not public, at least not at first. It takes place in the dim corner of your husband's cousin's barn, the smell of hay mingling with something sourer, old ale and older grudges. You weren't meant to know about it. You weren't meant to be anywhere near, but your husband is careless, or perhaps arrogant, and he leaves a scrap of parchment on the table when he steps out. It's a crude list scrawled in his hand, names of relatives and 2 village elders. The word claim sits beside your own name, underlined twice. You tell yourself it could mean anything. Then you hear voices later that night, slipping in through the cracks in the shutters. She won't give it up freely, says one man. His tone is bored, like discussing the weather. Then we give her reason to, your husband replies. The court will do the rest. Historians still argue whether most witchcraft accusations were truly religious matters or more often simple property disputes wrapped in piety's cloak. In this small circle of lamplight and low voices, there's no arguing at all. This isn't about your soul. It's about the land, the cottage, the silver spoon set you inherited from your aunt. One of them laughs softly. She's stubborn. Her mother was the same, always thought she knew better than the men. A pause. That won't be a problem much longer. There's a clink of mugs and a murmur of agreement. The barn doors creak sometime later, and the group spills out into the yard. You watch through the narrow gap between shutters as your husband lingers, looking up at the moon. There's no hint of doubt in his expression, only calculation. By morning, you notice your cousin-in-law avoiding your gaze. The miller's wife doesn't smile at you anymore. Even the children who used to ask for honey cakes keep their distance. Whatever was decided in that barn is already spreading its roots. In town, a man selling cloth pauses mid-transaction to ask, "Is it true you keep dried herbs in every room?" His tone is sly, but there's an undercurrent of fear. You almost laugh. Of course you keep herbs. Everyone does. But you see the way he glances at the women beside him, as if looking for confirmation of some darker meaning. That evening, your husband asks casually, Do you still have that little box your aunt left you? When you say yes, his eyes flicker in a way you've never noticed before. Not love, not concern, just the spark of a man measuring distance to a prize. You understand now. They aren't going to wait for you to stumble. They're going to push. And once the accusation is public, the outcome is already written. It begins with a sound you can't place at first. A low murmur, the kind you hear when people lean in too close, their breath catching on the edge of a whisper. It's long past midnight, and the house is silent, except for that soft, sibilant rhythm. You lie still, heart ticking louder than the clock in the hall, and strain to hear. The voices are coming from outside, near the lean-to where the woodpile rests. The window is just a short reach away. You shift slowly, lifting the edge of the curtain. The moonlight catches two figures standing close, heads bent together. One is your husband. The other, you recognize after a moment, is Master Gilles, the same parish clerk who reads aloud the court decrees. His face is shadowed, but you catch the glint of his thin spectacles when he tilts his head. "They'll believe it," Gilles says. His voice is confident, almost amused. All it takes is the right witness. Your husband's reply is sharper, quieter. "Make sure it's someone the priest trusts." The wind shifts, carrying the scent of damp earth and smoke, and the words turn indistinct. But the tone, the tone tells you enough. It's the tone of men setting a trap they know will spring exactly when they want it to. You remember reading somewhere that in certain parts of medieval Europe, a neighbor's word could outweigh your own protestations by sheer force of moral reputation. Historians still argue whether this legal imbalance was a quirk of flawed systems or a deliberate design to keep certain people, women like you, in their place. In the stillness of your darkened room, it feels less like debate and more like a weapon you can already see coming. The conversation outside stretches on. You hear phrases drift in and out. Unholy powders, sign of the devil's pact, the cat, of course. You blink. What about the cat? And then you remember the black one you took in last winter, half-starved and frostbitten. You'd laughed at the old superstition back then. It's harder to laugh now. Finally, footsteps recede toward the road, crunching over frostbitten grass. You hold your breath, waiting. Then another sound, lighter steps, the careful tread of someone returning. Your husband pushes open the back door and slips inside without a lantern. He pauses outside your room. For a moment, you think he might come in, but instead he lingers, breathing just on the other side of the door. Before moving away, you lie awake until dawn, watching shadows change shape on the wall, wondering how much time you have before whispers become words, and words become law. In the morning, the cat is gone. It starts small, as these things often do. A glance held too long. A conversation that halts the moment you enter the room. The way the baker's boy, who once carried your flour home without being asked, now turns his back and whistles off-key until you're gone. The first real sign is at the well. You've gone early, before the sun climbs high, hoping to avoid the gossiping knot of women who usually gather there. But one of them, Marta, with her sharp tongue and sharper elbows, is already drawing water. She gives you a tight smile, and in the moment between bucket and rope, she says, "They say you have dreams. It's not a question. You think about denying it, but there's no safe way to answer. Everyone dreams, but in the wrong mouth, a simple statement becomes proof. You force a neutral smile and say, "Everyone dreams, Marta." She sniffs, glances toward the church spire, and mutters, "Not like yours." By the time you walk home, the idea has taken root. People aren't looking you in the eye anymore. They're looking through you, as though checking for something beneath the skin. Historians still argue whether medieval witch trials relied more on fear of the supernatural or on the efficiency of rumor. The distinction feels academic now. Both are already working against you. One afternoon, you find a sprig of yarrow nailed to your doorframe. You've used yarrow in poultices and teas for years, but here, it's not a healing herb. It's a ward meant to keep you out. The irony stings. A child from 3 cottages down runs up to you in the lane, cheeks flushed, and blurts, "They say you can talk to crows." His mother snatches him away so fast his little feet barely touch the ground. You want to shout after her that it's just because you feed them scraps in winter, but the words choke in your throat. That night, you find the cat again, half wild now, skittish in the doorway. It yowls when you step closer, then bolts into the shadows. You stand there for a long time, staring after it, listening to the faint hum of voices from the tavern 2 streets away. Your name drifts on the air, wrapped in a laughter that doesn't sound kind. The whispers aren't whispers anymore. The next turn of the screw comes at the market. You're reaching for a length of linen, cheap, coarse, nothing fancy, when the merchant's wife steps in front of you. She doesn't touch you, doesn't even raise her voice, but her words are sharp enough to slice through the hum of barter and chatter. "We don't serve your kind." The stall goes quiet. Not the whole market, just the little circle where the accusation lands like a stone thrown into water. You stand there, hand half extended, wondering if she's talking about your family, your work, or that thing no one will say outright yet. You withdraw your hand slowly, as though not to spook an animal. You murmur, "I've bought from you for years." She stares, lips pinched, and says, "Years are a long time. Things change." And just like that, the prices at other stalls go up when you approach. The chicken seller is suddenly out of hens. The cobbler says he's too busy to mend your boots. You start walking home with your basket half empty, stomach tight with the knowledge that food isn't just sustenance now, it's politics. The legal historian in you, if you had one, might note that medieval witchcraft accusations often gained traction when property or livelihoods were at stake. A shunned woman becomes a weakened woman. A weakened woman becomes easy to strip of rights, then land. One evening, you catch your husband, your own husband, speaking in low tones to the parish priest outside the church door. You can't hear the words, but you can read the body language. His shoulders hunched, the priest's hand resting too lightly on his arm, the way both of them glance your way, and then apart. When you ask him about it later, he shrugs. He asked after your health. It's the sort of thing you can't disprove, and the sort of thing you can't unhear. The cat, still hanging around your doorstep, has taken to yowling in the middle of the night. You wake to the sound, heart pounding, wondering if it's a warning or just hunger. The neighbors will say it's your familiar, of course, that it's a demon in fur. The idea might be laughable if you weren't already on the edge of believing anything could turn against you. Historians still argue whether cats were more feared or revered in the Middle Ages. Either way, Yours seems to have chosen the wrong season to be seen with you. By week's end, your husband avoids your gaze more than he meets it. When you speak, he answers with grunts, and when you reach for his hand over supper, he moves it to his lap without looking at you. It feels less like a rift and more like the earth itself shifting beneath your feet. The kind of shift you can't stop. The kind you can only fall into. The first open accusation arrives not from a stranger, but from a cousin. It happens on a wet Tuesday, the kind where the clouds hang so low they seem to scrape the rooftops. You've gone to deliver a loaf of barley bread, your peace offering, to your aunt, hoping to keep at least one corner of the family from slipping away. But when you arrive, your cousin Agnes is already there, leaning against the hearth, arms folded. She doesn't greet you, doesn't even look surprised. Instead, she says, loud enough for your aunt to hear over the hiss of the kettle, "You bewitched him, didn't you? That's why he's sick." For a moment, you think she's joking. The man in question, her brother, caught a fever last winter that left him coughing for months. But people catch fevers. People die of them. It's just life here. Only, life here also means that when misfortune needs a cause, the most convenient target is the one already under suspicion. "I've done nothing," you say, too quickly, too sharply. Agnes tilts her head in that way that says, your denial is exactly what she expected. You've always had a strange way about you. Herbs, muttering, the cat, it's the cat again. You think of pointing out that she's the one who once paid you in onions to make a tea for her mother's stomach cramps. But you don't. Every word you speak now feels like dry kindling, waiting for a spark. Historians still argue whether accusations of witchcraft spread faster through kinship networks or through village rumor mills. Standing in your aunt's dim kitchen, it's clear the two are just different sides of the same coin. By the time you leave, your bread remains untouched on the table. You walk home in the drizzle, clutching the basket tighter than you mean to, aware that two women passing on the road stop talking as you approach. The next day, you find your husband watching you from the doorway while you grind grain. His gaze isn't hostile exactly, it's measuring. He asks, "What did you say to Agnes yesterday?" You tell him the truth. He nods slowly, then says, "She says you threatened her." Your hand still on the millstone. "That's a lie." He doesn't reply, just turns and walks away, leaving you with the sound of stone against grain, a slow grinding that feels like it could go on forever. That night, you dream of the cat curled on your chest, its weight pinning you down. You wake with the taste of earth in your mouth and the distant sound of the church bell marking the hour. The air feels thick, the kind that warns of a storm. It's not thunder you should be worrying about. The church summons arrives the next morning, carried by a boy who can't quite meet your eyes. He hands you the folded scrap of parchment, waits just long enough to see you read it, and then sprints away without a word. The seal is clumsy, but official enough to make your stomach knot. You are to present yourself before Father Ulrich at midday, no reason given, because none is needed. When the church calls, you go. You've been inside the church countless times, Easter, weddings, funerals, but today the air feels different. The scent of beeswax and incense is sharper, almost metallic. Father Ulrich waits near the altar, a book open before him. He begins softly, like a shepherd coaxing a stray lamb. "My child, he says, there have been concerns. His eyes are pale and still like ice over a pond. He asks about your herbs. You explain, again, that they're for healing. He asks about your dreams. You tell him you barely remember them. He asks about the cat, and you almost laugh. But his face tells you that would be a mistake. Historians still argue whether medieval clergy truly believed in the devil's constant meddling, or whether accusations of witchcraft were simply tools of control. As Father Ulrich leans closer, voice low and deliberate, you suspect it doesn't matter. Belief and utility are equally dangerous. He asks if you've spoken with the dead. You say no. He asks if you've cursed a neighbor. You say no. He asks if you've lain with a demon, and you almost choke on the absurdity. But you still say no. When it's over, he tells you the church will keep an eye on you. His tone makes it sound like a kindness. Outside, the square is half full with market stalls. People glance at you, then at each other. You feel as though a sign has been nailed above your head. That night, your husband doesn't speak much at supper. You notice he's been going out more often after dark. When you ask where, he shrugs. The tavern. But the next morning, you'll hear from Marta at the well that she saw him speaking to two men from the next parish, men who've served on trial juries before. She says it casually, like she's discussing the weather, but her eyes hold yours a beat too long. By now, the cat has stopped coming entirely. Even it knows when a place is no longer safe. It begins with whispers, as most ruin does. At first, they're too faint to catch. Snatches of words when you enter a room, a pause in conversation that lasts one beat too long. Then, like the creeping damp that rots the beams in an old cottage, they spread. You hear one at the baker's. Her milk turned sour. Another in the lane. She was seen in the woods at night. By the time you visit the market again, you hear the word plainly witch, spoken without shame, the way one might say thief or liar. The market square has always been noisy, but now the voices are pitched differently when they turn toward you. A girl selling onions stares at your hands as if expecting claws. An old man drops his gaze and mutters a prayer as you pass. Historians still argue whether such rumors were born from genuine fear or the grim satisfaction of watching someone else fall. Either way, the effect is the same. The world closes in. The trouble is, you know who is feeding these whispers. Your husband has been careful, yes, but not careful enough. You've overheard him speaking in the yard, his tone low but urgent, telling a story about your strange ways. It is always the same rhythm. Start with something small and true, then twist it just enough to curdle belief into suspicion. Why? You don't need to ask. You've noticed the documents missing from the locked chest, the way he's been visiting the magistrate's clerk under the pretense of paying taxes. In a world where a woman's property becomes her husband's on marriage, except for a few precious inheritances you kept under special agreement, accusations are not just about faith, they're about acquisition, a quirky detail the scholars rarely mention. In certain parishes, a proven witch's possessions were considered forfeit to both church and husband, sometimes split evenly. Enough incentive to turn piety into profit. One afternoon, you return from the well to find your door ajar. Inside, a small bundle of twigs lies neatly crossed on the hearthstone. It's not firewood, it's a sign, a mark left by those who want to warn or curse. You pick it up, throw it into the fire, and watch it catch. But in the flames, you can't help imagining your own face there, painted by some trembling apprentice, hung in the town hall under the grim title, Executed for Witchcraft. 14. That night, sleep comes in fits, and when it does, you dream of standing in the square, hands bound, while your husband watches from the crowd, not with triumph, not with sorrow, but with the kind of satisfaction that comes from closing a ledger. The summons to the magistrate comes on a day so bright it feels almost mocking. Sunlight spills over the square, gilding the thatched roofs, and you can hear children laughing somewhere behind the blacksmith shop. Life is moving forward, while yours feels like it's tightening into a noose. The man who delivers the message is one of the constable's aides, a boy young enough to still have a voice that cracks. He stares at the ground as he speaks, as though the words might be safer if they don't look directly at you. The magistrate's hall smells of parchment, damp stone, and faintly of ale. He's not above taking his comforts during work. Magistrate Kellen sits in a high-backed chair, the light from the window catching in his thinning hair. His eyes, though, are sharp. They linger on you the way a crow studies a scrap of bread, deciding if it's worth taking. He starts with polite questions, your daily routines, your work, your knowledge of herbs. Then his tone hardens. He asks whether you've consorted with dark forces. He brings up names, Marta, the baker's wife, even the midwife from 2 parishes over, women who've expressed concern about your behavior. You know those women have only repeated what your husband seeded. Historians still argue whether these interrogations were truly about finding truth or simply about breaking someone's spirit until they said what the court wanted to hear. Here, under Kellen's gaze, you realize the difference is academic. Then comes the quirky bit, the thing you would almost laugh at if the room didn't feel so suffocating. He produces a book, its cover cracked with age, and reads a line about witches being able to swim against the will of God. You've heard of this, water ordeal tests, where an accused is thrown into a pond to see if they float. Kellen doesn't say he'll do this, but the way his lips curve tells you he's thinking it. When you deny every charge, he leans back and says, "We'll see. You're dismissed," but you notice 2 of the constable's men shadowing you all the way home. Not openly, just close enough for you to hear their boots on the cobbles. Inside, you find your husband sitting at the table, a parchment in front of him. He folds it before you can see the writing, but not before you catch the edge of a seal. He tells you, almost cheerfully, that the magistrate is only doing his duty, and you shouldn't take it personally. You want to scream at him that this isn't duty, it's execution in slow motion. But you swallow the words, because in this place, the wrong outburst could be recorded as evidence. That night, as you lie in bed pretending to sleep, you hear him slip out. His boots are soft on the packed earth, but the door's latch clicks like a verdict. He comes back just before dawn, smelling faintly of smoke and ale. You pretend not to notice, but the sharp edge of his movements tells you he wants you to. When he finally collapses into bed, his breathing turns heavy in minutes, as though his conscience has nothing to carry. By mid-morning, you discover what he's been doing. A neighbor, a woman you've known since childhood, stops you outside the bakery, her hands twisting in her apron. She doesn't meet your eyes when she says, "They say your husband's been to the tavern, telling stories." The stories aren't harmless. They're pieces of you, bent out of shape until they sound like curses. How you walked alone in the woods for hours last spring, collecting mushrooms. How the cat followed you like a shadow because you fed it scraps. How you once stayed by the river all night, tending to an injured boy who'd fallen in. Historians still argue whether spousal accusations in witch trials were acts of self-preservation, spite, or simply greed. In your case, there's no mystery. It's greed wearing the mask of morality. At the market, you feel the stares more openly now. A butcher you bought from for years tells you they're out of the good cuts before selling them to the next woman in line. A potter raises her prices just for you. The air feels thicker, as though the entire town has agreed to breathe in unison against you. And then there's the odd little moment, the one you can't decide is funny or terrifying. A gaggle of children trail behind you, chanting a nonsense rhyme about witch's bread and crow's eyes. It's tuneless, half giggled, but there's something in the repetition that gnaws at you. Somewhere, an adult taught them those words. That evening, you confront your husband. You ask him, calmly, why he's telling these things. His smile is a slow, deliberate thing. Because, he says, truth has a way of coming out. You realize, with a hollow ache, that he's no longer even pretending to protect you. When he leaves again that night, you follow him at a distance. His path winds to the magistrate's house, where a warm glow leaks from the shutters. You stand in the shadows, watching him slip inside, and wonder if you've just seen the final thread snap. The next day begins with a knock that's too polite to be friendly. 3 men stand at your door, all in plain wool cloaks, but each wearing the badge of the town council pinned to their chest. One carries a small leather book, another a sealed document tube, and the third, his eyes sharp and restless, holds nothing at all, as though his purpose is simply to watch. They ask to come in. You know that in these moments, refusing is worse than agreeing, so you step aside. The one with the book begins asking questions in the same tone you might use to ask about the weather, where you were on certain nights, what herbs you kept in your home, whether you've ever spoken to someone already accused. Historians still argue whether such visits were meant as genuine investigation or as intimidation to provoke mistakes. In truth, they often worked as both. They note down your answers with quiet precision, though you can see in their faces that the answers themselves hardly matter. The man with the sealed tube finally breaks the rhythm. He unrolls a parchment bearing the magistrate's seal and reads aloud. An official complaint has been lodged against you, claiming maleficium, harm by witchcraft. The words are formal, heavy, and unmistakable. Then comes the peculiar part, the detail you'll remember even in your worst dreams. They hand you a slip of paper no larger than a palm, on which is drawn a crude circle with a cross through it. For your own safety, one of them says, hang it by your door. Whether it's a warning or a test, you can't tell. That evening, when your husband returns, you tell him what happened. He only shrugs and says, you must have given them a reason. No denial, no concern. Just that slight upward curl at the corner of his mouth, like a man waiting for a plan to mature. Later, as you sit by the fire, you find yourself touching your own wrists, wondering how the rope would feel there. They don't arrest you right away. That would be too obvious, too abrupt for a town that prides itself on order. Instead, The days stretch into a strange performance. People you've known for years stop mid-step when they see you, turning their faces away as if the sight of you could plant a curse in their minds. Others stare too long, whispering in pairs, then walking off quickly when you notice. The baker's wife no longer sells you bread directly. She sends her apprentice, who leaves the loaf on the counter and takes your coin with a hand that doesn't meet yours. The priest greets you at Sunday Mass, but the blessing is shorter, as though God's grace must be rationed in your presence. One afternoon, while you're sweeping the floor, two of the council's men appear again, this time with a small wooden chest. Inside are objects they claim to have found near your home: a bundle of twigs tied with red thread, a wax figure with a pin in its chest, and a scrap of parchment with Latin words you can't read. You tell them you've never seen these things before, but they exchange a glance that says the protest is already filed under expected. Historians still argue whether such evidence was planted or simply gathered from anywhere it could be found to fit the accusation. Either way, it worked. People believed, and belief in a place like this is heavier than truth. Your husband doesn't speak much to you now. He spends more time at the tavern, more time in whispered conversations you're not invited to hear. Once, you catch a fragment, your name, and the word property. That night, you can't sleep. You lie awake, listening to the wood creak, the wind press against the shutters, the faint sound of a rat in the rafters. You wonder if the men who plant wax dolls also plant other things, words, ideas, doubts, into the minds of the ones you thought would stand beside you. And somewhere, deep in your chest, the first cold thread of certainty winds tight. This isn't about magic. It never was. The summons comes in the morning, delivered by a boy who looks barely old enough to hold the sealed parchment without trembling. He doesn't meet your eyes, just thrusts it forward and bolts before you can speak. The red wax breaks with a soft snap. And there it is, in tidy, looping script. You are ordered to appear before the town magistrate for questioning on the charge of witchcraft. No date of return is mentioned. You read it twice, then set it on the table. The room seems to shrink around you. Your husband, sitting across from you, takes a slow sip from his mug and says, "Best not keep them waiting." His tone is so casual, you almost mistake it for kindness, until you see the glint in his eyes, the one that says everything is unfolding exactly as he hoped. You walk to the courthouse, under the gaze of neighbors who suddenly have urgent business at their windows. The square smells faintly of wood smoke and damp earth. Inside, the magistrate sits at a long table flanked by two clerks. His robe is a dull brown, but the chain around his neck catches the light like a snake's flicker. They ask you to state your name, your age, your place of birth. Then the real questions begin. Have you ever cursed an animal? Have you met with spirits? Have you been visited by the devil in the form of a man, a beast, or a shadow? Historians still argue whether these questions were designed to uncover truth or to trap the accused into contradictions. You soon realize it doesn't matter. Either way, every answer feels wrong. The magistrate leans forward, folding his hands. Your own husband has attested that you've spoken words in the night while sleeping. Unnatural words. You turn toward your husband, who stands quietly by the door, and for a moment the whole world narrows to the fact that he doesn't look away. The session ends without verdict, only the cold instruction to remain available for further inquiry. But as you step outside into the gray daylight, you know the process has already begun to devour you. That evening, you notice the charm they gave you to hang on your door is gone. In its place is a single black feather. You don't have to wait long for further inquiry. 3 days later, they come for you, not with parchment this time, but with iron. 2 guards appear at dawn, their breath steaming in the cold, their boots leaving dark prints on the frost. They don't knock. They push the door open and step inside like they own the air you're breathing. Your husband is already dressed, leaning against the wall. He doesn't intervene. He doesn't even look surprised. One of the guards reads a formal statement aloud, accusing you of practicing maleficium, harmful magic, against both people and property. The words tumble over each other in legal Latin, but you catch enough to know this isn't a polite invitation to talk. This is the start of your confinement. The walk to the jail is short, but it feels endless. The street is lined with faces, neighbors, children, strangers drawn by the noise. You hear muttered prayers, but you also hear snickers. Someone throws a handful of grain at you, a superstition meant to reveal witches, as the kernels supposedly bounce differently off guilty skin. You keep walking. The jail smells of mildew and old straw. Your cell is barely the length of your body, and so narrow you can touch both walls at once. A single barred window lets in a shaft of gray light, but no warmth. The guards take your shoes, your belt, and the silver cross your mother gave you. When you protest about the cross, one mutters, "You won't be needing charms in there." Historians still argue whether medieval prison was intended to hold people for judgment or simply break them before trial. In truth, it did both. Poor air, poor food, and the slow erosion of mind and body made most prisoners ready to say anything if it meant stepping outside again. That night, the straw beneath you crackles with movement. You lie still, listening to the scurry of rats and the distant echo of boots in the corridor. Somewhere outside, church bells mark the hour, but you've lost track of which one. You wonder if your husband is sleeping soundly in the bed you once shared, or if he's awake, counting the coins he'll gain when you're gone. They bring you to the interrogation chamber at first light. It's colder here than in your cell, though a fire burns in the grate. The room is almost empty, except for a long table, 2 chairs, and something draped under a coarse linen cloth. The magistrate is already seated, quill poised. Beside him stands the bailiff, a stocky man with a nose like a blunt axe. He gestures for you to sit, and you do, the wood beneath you creaking under your weight. The questions begin again. Simple at first. Do you attend church regularly? Have you ever brewed remedies from herbs? Do you own a black cat? You answer carefully, but you can feel the net tightening. Then they bring up your dreams. Your husband says you speak to unseen visitors in your sleep, the magistrate says. He claims you name them, one by one. You deny it, but the bailiff leans forward, his shadow falling over the table. Confess now, and we can spare you worse. Historians still argue whether such worse was a threat or a promise. Here, in this moment, it feels like both. The cloth on the far table is pulled away, revealing not weapons, but strange devices, ropes, pulleys, and an oddly shaped stool. None are bloody, all are clean. Somehow, that makes them more frightening. The questioning grows sharper. They press about your remedies, insisting that healing without a physician's license is a crime in itself, proof of unnatural power. You try to explain that most villagers can't afford a doctor, that a handful of mint or willow bark is all they have, but your words skim off them like pebbles on ice. Hours pass, or maybe only minutes. The magistrate finally sighs, dips his quill, and notes that you are to be examined further. You're led back to your cell, your wrists sore from the ropes. That night, you hear someone crying in another cell. The sound rises and falls until it becomes almost a chant. It's only then you realize the voice belongs to a woman you knew, a midwife who vanished from the village months ago. You don't call out. You're not sure either of you would survive the conversation. Morning comes with the scrape of a key in the lock. Today, there's no pretense of polite questioning. They take you straight to a low, windowless chamber beneath the jail. The air is damp, carrying the scent of stone and rust. Two men are already there, both in leather aprons. They're not masked, which means they don't expect you to live long enough to identify them later. One of them rolls up his sleeves, revealing forearms like carved oak. The other lays out tools, not sharp, but designed for strain. A rope wound around a spindle, iron boots with adjustable plates, a frame that looks uncomfortably like a rack for drying hides. The bailiff tells you again, a confession will spare you the worst. His voice is almost weary, as though he's done this too many times to count. Historians still argue whether medieval torturers believed they were saving souls or simply following orders. What's certain is that they were methodical. They start with persuasion, tight cords around your arms and legs, pulled until your joints hum with pain. Not enough to maim, just enough to remind you that resistance is a choice with a cost. They ask the same questions as before, only now each answer feels like a wager. Your husband's name comes up again. How long had you quarreled? Did you curse him? Did you ever wish him harm? You insist no, but the truth is irrelevant. They're writing their own version as you speak. At one point, they pause to offer you water. You're so thirsty you almost say yes, but you remember the whispered stories. Drink during questioning, and they'll claim you're replenishing the fluids needed for magic. You shake your head. When they finally release you, your muscles tremble so badly you can barely stand. You're dragged back to your cell, the straw prickling at your skin like nettles. Somewhere above, life in the town goes on. Bread is baked, children play, gossip flows. Down here, your world has shrunk to stone, darkness, and the ticking thought that your fate is already sealed. The final summons comes on a gray morning, the kind where the light itself seems reluctant to enter. You're led, not to the questioning chamber, but to the town square. The air smells faintly of rain and smoke, and the sound of murmuring voices grows louder as you approach. The crowd is already gathered, neighbors, strangers, and the few who once called you friend. Some look away when they see you, others stare openly, eager for the spectacle. At the far end of the square stands the magistrate, robes pressed and dry despite the weather. Your husband is beside him, his face carved into that same cold mask he's worn since the day of your arrest. They read the verdict in a voice so flat it could belong to anyone. Guilty of witchcraft, consorting with spirits, and the use of charms to bring misfortune. There's no mention of love lost, or property gained, or the petty jealousy that started it all. Historians still argue whether most such trials were ever about the supernatural, or simply convenient ways to settle scores. The official record always makes it seem inevitable, as though the universe itself demanded it. They give you one last chance to confess, to save your soul. You say nothing. The silence is your final act of ownership, the only thing left that belongs to you. The sentence is carried out with the efficiency of people who've done this before. You're bound, the rope rough against your wrists. The sound of the crowd dulls into a single, steady hum, almost like the background fan you once imagined in another life. As the world narrows, you think, not of the accusations nor the faces here, but of the scent of warm bread on a summer morning, the feel of soil between your fingers, and the laughter of a time before all this began. The sky opens just as the moment comes, rain washing over the square, blurring every face into shadow. And now, as the square fades, so too does the sharpness of the scene. The voices grow distant, the cobblestones soften under your feet until they're nothing more than ripples in water. You find yourself walking away, slow and unhurried, into a meadow where the air smells of time and clean rain. The ground is warm, and the grass bends gently beneath your steps, as though it's glad to have you here. The wind moves in a steady rhythm, carrying with it the low murmur of the river nearby. Somewhere a lark calls, then another answers. Their voices are not urgent, not demanding, just simple, steady notes in the quiet. The fear, the noise, the cold, all of it is behind you now, shrinking into the distance until it's no more than a faint smudge on the horizon. Ahead, there's only the path, winding into soft hills, lined with wildflowers that nod as you pass. You pause for a moment to breathe. The air here is different, cool, sweet, and unburdened. It fills your chest without weight, without the ache of the jail's damp shadows. Your hands, unbound, brush against the tall grass, and the sensation is so real, so grounding, that you linger there, letting the moment stretch. In this place, there are no accusations, no verdicts, no need to explain yourself. Only the rustle of leaves, the warmth of the sun, and the slow, steady beat of your own heart. You walk on, feeling lighter with every step, until even your shadow seems to fade into the meadow's golden light. And here, in this quiet, you rest. End of script. Sweet dreams?